The Galactic Council, a vast and powerful assembly of alien species, had encountered many worlds and many forms of life. When they discovered Earth, they saw humanity as nothing more than a primitive and harmless species. Humans were small, physically weaker compared to many other species in the galaxy, and their technology was laughably outdated. The Council decided that humans posed no threat to the grand designs of the galaxy, so they allowed them to settle on a remote planet far from the core worlds. Jake was one of the humans living on this distant planet. He was an ordinary man by human standards, tall with a rugged appearance and a quiet demeanor. But among the Thraxians, the dominant species on the planet, he was nothing more than an insect. The Thraxians were a towering reptilian race with scales as tough as armor and strength that could shatter stone. They viewed humans as weak, insignificant creatures, only good for menial tasks and entertainment. The Thraxians enjoyed playing cruel games with the humans, testing their limits and mocking their frailty. Jake had become a regular target for their amusement. Whenever he walked through the bustling streets of the alien city, the Thraxians would jeer and taunt him. They would shove him, trip him, and sometimes even strike him for no reason other than to see him stumble. Jake would grit his teeth and bear it, knowing that fighting back was useless. The Thraxians were too strong, too powerful. Any resistance would only make things worse, but deep inside, Jake was seething with anger. Every insult, every shove, every punch chipped away at his patience. The Thraxians believed that humans were too weak to fight back, that they would always remain docile and submissive. And for a long time, Jake played the part, keeping his head down and avoiding conflict. But the Thraxians didn't know that humans had a breaking point, a line that, once crossed, would unleash something primal and terrifying. One day, as Jake was walking through the market square, a group of young Thraxians spotted him. They were bored and looking for some fun, and Jake seemed like the perfect target. One of them, a particularly large and arrogant Thraxian named Kor, approached Jake with a sneer. He towered over the human, his scales glinting in the sunlight, and jabbed a clawed finger into Jake's chest. "Hey, little human," Kor hissed, his voice dripping with contempt. "Why don't you dance for us? Show us how you monkeys have fun." The other Thraxians laughed, forming a circle around Jake, cutting off any escape. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the mocking gazes of the Thraxians boring into his soul. He clenched his fists, trying to control the rage bubbling inside him. But Kor wasn't done. He grabbed Jake by the collar and lifted him off the ground, shaking him like a rag doll. "Come on, dance!" Kor roared, his voice echoing through the square. "Or are you too scared, little human?" The laughter grew louder, the Thraxians' jeers becoming more vicious. Jake's vision blurred with anger. His body trembled, not with fear, but with the effort of holding back the storm inside him. For so long, he had endured their abuse, telling himself that it wasn't worth the fight. But now, something inside him snapped. Jake's eyes narrowed, and a cold, dangerous calm settled over him. He looked Kor dead in the eyes, his voice low and steady. "Put me down," he said, his words carrying a weight that made Kor hesitate. The Thraxian sneered again, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, Jake struck. The human's fist connected with Kor's jaw, a blow fueled by all the pent-up rage and frustration. The force of the punch took the Thraxian by surprise, sending him staggering back. The laughter stopped, replaced by shocked silence. The other Thraxians stared in disbelief as Jake stood his ground, his eyes burning with a fire they had never seen before. This was not the harmless, submissive human they had always thought him to be. This was something else, something dangerous. And in that moment, they realized that they had made a terrible mistake. The square fell into a stunned silence. The Thraxians, who had always seen humans as weak and pathetic, were frozen in disbelief. Kor, the largest and most arrogant of them, staggered back, clutching his jaw where Jake's punch had landed. He had never imagined that a human could strike with such force, let alone stand up to him. For a moment, the only sound was the echo of Jake's fist meeting Kor's face. Jake didn't move. His hand still tingled from the impact, but his mind was clear. The anger that had been simmering inside him for so long had finally boiled over, and now there was no turning back. He had crossed the line, and he knew there would be consequences. But at that moment, he didn't care. He had taken enough abuse, and he was done playing the part of the submissive human. Kor's shock quickly turned to rage. His reptilian eyes narrowed as he straightened up, towering over Jake once more. The crowd of Thraxians began to murmur, their initial shock giving way to a mix of anger and anticipation. They wanted to see Kor put the human in his place, to reassert the dominance they believed was their birthright. "You'll regret that, human," Kor growled, his voice filled with venom. He bared his sharp teeth, his claws flexing as he prepared to retaliate. The Thraxians around him sneered, eager to see Jake punished for his defiance. But Jake was beyond fear. The sight of Kor's bared teeth and the murmurs of the crowd only fueled his resolve. He had endured their cruelty for too long, and now that he had finally fought back, he wasn't going to back down. He squared his shoulders and locked eyes with Kor, his expression hard as steel. "Come on, then," Jake said, his voice calm but filled with an underlying threat. "Let's see what you've got." Kor lunged at Jake with a roar, his claws slashing through the air. The Thraxians watched, expecting Jake to be torn apart in seconds. But Jake moved with a speed and precision that caught them all off guard. He dodged Kor's attack, slipping to the side just in time. Before Kor could react, Jake drove his knee into the Thraxian's midsection, using all his strength. The blow knocked the wind out of Kor, doubling him over in pain. The crowd gasped. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. A human wasn't supposed to be able to fight back, let alone hurt one of their strongest warriors. But Jake was relentless. He followed up with a series of quick, brutal punches, each one landing with deadly accuracy. Kor tried to defend himself, but he was too slow, too bulky. Jake was like a whirlwind, a force of nature that the Thraxians had never seen in a human before. Kor finally managed to grab Jake, using his massive strength to lift him off the ground. But Jake didn't panic. Instead, he twisted in Kor's grip, using the Thraxian's own momentum against him. He wrapped his legs around Kor's arm and delivered a sharp elbow to the side of Kor's head. The impact stunned the Thraxian, and he stumbled, losing his grip on Jake. Jake dropped to the ground and immediately went on the offensive. He knew he had to end this quickly before Kor could recover. With a fierce determination, he aimed a powerful kick at Kor's knee, forcing the Thraxian to his knees. Then, with a final burst of strength, Jake leaped onto Kor's back, wrapping his arm around the Thraxian's throat in a chokehold. Kor thrashed and clawed at Jake, but the human's grip was like iron. The Thraxian's face turned a darker shade of green as he struggled to breathe. The crowd watched in horrified silence as their champion was brought to the brink of unconsciousness by the very creature they had always considered inferior. As Kor's strength began to fade, Jake leaned in close and whispered into his ear, his voice cold and unforgiving. "You should never have underestimated us." With that, Kor's body went limp, and Jake let him drop to the ground, unconscious. The square was dead silent as Jake stood over the defeated Thraxian, his chest heaving with the effort of the fight. The other Thraxians looked at him with a mix of fear and disbelief. They had pushed Jake too far, and now they had awakened something they were not prepared to face. The Thraxians stood in stunned silence as Kor lay motionless on the ground. No one moved, no one spoke. The idea that a human could defeat a Thraxian warrior was unthinkable. But there Jake stood, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, his eyes blazing with an intensity that sent chills down the spines of the onlookers. For a moment, the entire square was frozen in time, the air thick with tension and disbelief. But the silence didn't last long. A Thraxian elder, one of the few who had witnessed the event from a distance, stepped forward. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Jake, assessing the situation with a mix of anger and fear. This human had not only fought back, but had humiliated one of their own in front of everyone. Such defiance could not go unpunished. The elder raised his hand, signaling the other Thraxians to surround Jake. Slowly, they began to close in, their faces twisted with fury. Jake's fists tightened, and he shifted his stance, ready to fight again if necessary. He knew he was outnumbered, and these Thraxians wouldn't make the same mistakes Kor had made. But something inside him, something primal and ancient, refused to back down. Just as the first Thraxian lunged at him, Jake moved. But this time it wasn't with the calculated precision he had shown before. This time it was raw, uncontrollable rage. Jake's movements were swift and brutal, his fists and feet striking out with a force that seemed impossible for a human. The first Thraxian fell, clutching his side where Jake had struck with an elbow. The next went down with a kick that shattered his knee. The remaining Thraxians hesitated, unsure whether to advance or retreat, but Jake didn't give them time to decide. He charged forward, his vision narrowing until all he could see were the enemies in front of him. The crowd gasped as Jake tackled one of the Thraxians to the ground, his fists raining down blows with a relentless fury. Then, the unthinkable happened. As Jake fought, something deep inside him snapped completely. His rage turned into something darker, something that pushed him beyond the limits of sanity. He wasn't just fighting to defend himself anymore. He was fighting to destroy, to make the Thraxians feel the pain and humiliation they had inflicted on him and his people. Without warning, Jake grabbed the Thraxian he had pinned to the ground and, in one horrific motion, he sank his teeth into the alien's face. The crowd recoiled in horror as Jake tore at the Thraxian's flesh, his teeth ripping through the thick scales with terrifying ferocity. Blood, a dark green in color, spurted from the wound, staining Jake's face and clothes. The Thraxian screamed, a sound that echoed through the square and sent waves of fear rippling through the crowd. But Jake didn't stop. He bit down harder, his jaw clenched with rage as he tore a chunk of flesh from the Thraxian's face. The alien's struggles grew weaker, and soon he lay still, his face a gruesome mess of blood and torn flesh. The other Thraxians backed away, their eyes wide with shock and terror. They had never seen anything like this. Humans were supposed to be weak, passive, easily controlled. But this was something else entirely. Jake stood up, his breathing heavy, his mouth and hands stained with the Thraxian's blood. He looked around at the crowd, his eyes wild and unhinged, daring anyone else to challenge him. But no one did. The Thraxians were too stunned, too afraid to move. They had pushed a human too far, and now they were witnessing the horrifying consequences. The realization hit them like a wave. Humans weren't just harmless creatures. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and capable of acts of violence that even the fiercest Thraxian warriors couldn't match. As the weight of what he had done began to sink in, Jake's rage started to fade, replaced by a cold, hollow feeling in the pit of his stomach. He looked down at his hands, at the blood that wasn't his own, and felt a wave of nausea wash over him. But it was too late to take back what he had done. The damage was done, and now there was no turning back. The Thraxians watched in fear and awe as Jake, the human they had once considered beneath them, stood victorious, having crossed a line that no one had ever imagined a human could cross. And in that moment, they knew that the galaxy had just changed forever. The news of the incident spread like wildfire across the planet and beyond. It was as if the entire galaxy had been shaken awake from a deep sleep. The Thraxians, who had always considered themselves the dominant species on the planet, were now gripped by a fear they had never known before. The image of Jake, a lone human standing victorious over two Thraxian warriors with blood on his hands and a look of wild determination in his eyes, was etched into their minds. In the days following the unthinkable act, the once bustling streets of the Thraxian cities became eerily quiet. Thraxians who had once walked with pride and arrogance now moved with caution, their eyes darting nervously at the sight of any human. Conversations were hushed and rumors flew from one corner of the city to another. What had happened to Kor and the others was no longer just a story, it was a warning. Jake had become a symbol of something far more dangerous than the Thraxians had ever anticipated. He was no longer just a human. He was a reminder that the creatures they had thought of as weak and insignificant could snap and unleash a fury that could not be controlled. And that realization brought with it a chilling fear. The Thraxian leadership quickly convened to discuss the situation. The council hall, usually a place of grand decisions and plans for expansion, was now filled with anxious voices and tense faces. The elders, who had once dismissed humans as nothing more than pests, now debated what to do about this new threat. "We cannot allow this to go unpunished," one elder said, his voice trembling with both anger and fear. "If we do nothing, the humans will think they can challenge us without consequences. We must show them that we are still in control." "But how?" another elder countered. "We've already seen what one human can do when pushed too far. If we strike against them, we risk provoking them even more. What if more of them turn against us? What if this is just the beginning?" The room fell silent as the weight of those words settled over them. The idea that humans, once seen as harmless, could pose a real threat to the Thraxian way of life was something none of them had ever considered. And now, faced with the reality of it, they were at a loss for what to do. Meanwhile, among the humans, the mood was one of both hope and fear. Word had spread quickly through their small communities about what Jake had done. Some saw him as a hero, someone who had finally stood up to the Thraxians and shown them that humans were not to be trifled with. Others were terrified, fearing that Jake's actions would bring the full wrath of the Thraxians down upon them all. Jake himself was haunted by what he had done. The blood on his hands had long since dried, but the memory of that moment, the moment he had crossed a line he never thought he would, was something he couldn't escape. He knew he had acted out of rage, out of a deep-seated need to defend himself and his people. But the violence he had unleashed was something that scared him as much as it did the Thraxians. He had become the spark that ignited a fire of fear and uncertainty across the planet. And as he walked through the human settlements, he could see the way people looked at him now, with a mix of admiration and apprehension. They respected him for what he had done, but they also feared what it meant for their future. The Thraxians, once confident in their superiority, were now on edge. They didn't know what the humans would do next, and that uncertainty gnawed at them. For the first time, they were forced to consider the possibility that they were not as invincible as they had believed. The fear of the unknown, of what might come next, spread through their ranks like a plague. And so the planet remained in a state of uneasy tension. The balance of power had shifted, and no one knew what the next move would be. But one thing was certain. The fear that Jake had instilled in the Thraxians would not easily be forgotten. It was a fear that would change the course of history, not just for the Thraxians, but for the entire galaxy. Weeks passed since Jake's shocking act, and the planet had undergone a profound change. The fear that had gripped the Thraxians had slowly transformed into something they had never thought they would feel toward humans: respect. The Thraxians, who had once looked down on humans as lesser beings, now viewed them with a mixture of caution and admiration. Jake's defiance had done more than just win a fight. It had altered the very fabric of the relationship between the two species. The Thraxian Council, once consumed with debates on how to punish the humans, had come to a surprising conclusion. They realized that continued hostility would only lead to more violence, something neither side truly wanted. Instead, they decided on a different approach, one that would acknowledge the strength and resilience the humans had shown. In a public announcement broadcast across the planet, the Thraxian leader addressed both Thraxians and humans. His voice, usually dripping with arrogance, was now measured and calm. "We have seen the strength of the human spirit," he began, his tone carrying an unexpected weight of sincerity, "and we acknowledge that strength with respect. No longer will humans be treated as inferiors. From this day forward, they will be regarded as equals with the same rights and protections as any Thraxian." The announcement sent shockwaves through both communities. For the humans, it was a moment of triumph, a validation of everything they had endured. They had fought for their dignity, and now they had won it. The fear that had hung over them like a dark cloud began to lift, replaced by a newfound sense of pride and hope for the future. Jake, the man who had sparked this revolution, found himself at the center of it all. He was hailed as a hero among his people, though he struggled to accept the title. The violence he had committed still weighed heavily on his conscience, but he couldn't deny the impact it had made. His actions had forced the Thraxians to see humans in a new light, to respect them in a way they never had before. One day, as Jake walked through the human settlement, he was approached by a Thraxian, a young warrior, much like Kor had been. But this Thraxian did not approach with hostility. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect. "Jake," he said, his voice low and serious, "I want you to know that not all of us hated your kind. Many of us were raised to believe that humans were weak, but you've shown us the truth. You've earned our respect." Jake nodded, unsure of how to respond. He had never sought respect through violence, but he couldn't ignore the change it had brought. "We never wanted this," Jake replied, his voice steady. "All we ever wanted was to live in peace without fear. Maybe now we can." The Thraxian warrior nodded in agreement. "Maybe we can," he said, "and maybe in time we can learn from each other." There's much we don't know about your kind, just as there's much you don't know about us. In the days that followed, tentative steps were taken toward cooperation between humans and Thraxians. There were still tensions, and not everyone was ready to embrace the new reality, but the seeds of change had been planted. Humans were invited to Thraxian cities, not as servants or laborers, but as guests and equals. Trade agreements were discussed, and for the first time, Thraxian leaders sought the input of human representatives. Jake remained a reluctant hero. He preferred to stay out of the spotlight, but he couldn't escape the role he had played in changing the world. Whenever he walked through the streets, both humans and Thraxians would nod to him in acknowledgement, a silent sign of the respect he had earned. As the planet began to heal from the scars of its past, a new chapter was written in the history of both species. The Thraxians, once so sure of their superiority, had learned to respect those they had once oppressed, and the humans, who had fought so long for their dignity, had finally gained the respect they deserved. In the end, Jake's actions had done more than just change the course of a single battle. They had changed the course of history. The fear that had once ruled the planet was slowly being replaced by something far more powerful: mutual respect. And with that respect came the hope that, one day, true peace might finally be possible.